Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to MEED's latest webinar this month on the Middle East and Africa hydrogen projects market. Now, I'm sure most of you will be accustomed to these webinars by now, but just for those of you who are new, welcome to the MEED webinar series. My name is Edward James. I'm the head of content and research at MEED for the Middle East and Africa. And today I'll be giving a roughly 30-minute to 40-minute presentation webinar on the hydrogen projects market in the two regions. Now, as ever, the presentation is being recorded, and as I speak, you should be all receiving in your inbox a copy of the presentation itself. So if you miss any part of it, or you are not able to get all the data during the course of this presentation, then you can go and download the presentation from your inbox, and also in the next couple of days be able to view the recording of this webinar. So don't worry if you are not able to catch everything. There will be an opportunity to review this all again later. Okay, so we'll do a presentation for about 30-40 minutes, and then at the end of that, I'll be hosting a Q&A session with you all. If you do have any questions, you have a Q&A box in your Zoom bar, and you can submit your questions in there. And then after this presentation, I'll get a chance, hopefully, to be able to answer them if I can. And that should last about 15 to 20 minutes or so. And once I've answered your questions, we'll end the session. So without further ado, let's move on to the presentation itself. Now, before I begin, I just wanted to explain a little bit about MEED and who I work for. MEED encompasses two main products. One is MEED.com, which is our news, features, and analysis service. You can see that here, MEED.com. If you want to know more, please visit that website. And our second product is a projects database of all known projects in the Middle East and Africa, and that's MEED Projects, and you can visit that website at meedprojects.com. And it's through these two products that we are able to track and quantify what's happening in the projects market across all sectors in the Africa and Middle East. As a result, we can quantify the values of projects and what's happening, as well as understand the size of the market, trends and opportunities and challenges as well. So please, when you have a chance, check out these two websites. So you'll find them very valuable indeed. Right, next step, I just also wanted to inform you that all of the data that you see today, as well as a lot more in much more granular data and format, is in our forthcoming Middle East and Africa Hydrogen Projects 2023 report. This will come out at the end of the month. And for those of you on here today, there is a early bird discount with $100 off on top of the pre-launch report price. And if you purchase the report before 25th of November, you'll be able to benefit from those two discounts. You can scan the code here or visit the website buy.meed.com. The report is 300 plus pages, and today the webinar just gives you a sort of kind of preview of some of the data that you can find in the report as a whole. Right, now let's just go a quick overview of the hydrogen market. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with the hydrogen industry projects, how it all works and how it all ties together. But just a very quick summary and review. As you can see here, there are two main ways of being able to produce hydrogen. Currently, most of the world's hydrogen is a byproduct of downstream hydrocarbon processing. And for the most part, that in turn, that byproduct tends to be reused within that industrial cluster around that downstream processes. Now, when we are looking at hydrogen projects, particularly in the Middle East and Africa, we are focusing a lot on green hydrogen projects, which is a developing market and sector where hydrogen is electrolyzed using power created from primarily solar, wind, renewable resources, as well as hydropower. And as a result, because it's using renewable energy, is carbon free, so it has no emissions. You can then use the hydrogen from that electrolysis process in a number of different ways. You can use it for create ammonia, for fertilizer production. You can use it for power production, for car fueling, for gas turbines, and even home heating. So it has a variety of uses, and the interest level really is because it's a carbon free source of energy without emissions, and therefore is a clean fuel and able to be compatible with net zero targets and the long-term ambition to reduce global warming and global emissions. So this is one of the reasons why it is emerging so fast. And now just to explain, just to go into that in a little bit more detail, here you can see that hydrogen, as I said, is a very flexible potential fuel source. It can be used in industry as a means of decarbonizing energy production and processes used downstream. It can be used as a fuel for transport. It can be used, as I mentioned, to heat homes, and also can be used as a feedstock for various chemical, mainly methanol production. As I explained earlier, there are two main ways of being able to produce hydrogen, otherwise known as H2 in terms of its chemical formula. Green hydrogen uses renewable energy to power the electrolysis process, where we're splitting water and oxygen and hydrogen in the water, and then using that hydrogen either to convert it to green ammonia for transportation or for fertilizer usage for synthetic fuels, or simply exporting or the hydrogen itself via various means. You can liquefy it and transport it in ships, either as hydrogen and then ammonia, reconverting back to hydrogen at the destination. It can also be trucked. It can use existing gas pipeline networks, can even be stored as well. And then its end uses, as we said, quite varied. You can use it across different functions of the industry. So it's no surprise that hydrogen is something that is increasingly being talked about, especially given high energy prices right now and the pressing need to reduce emissions. Now, hydrogen in the Middle East and Africa is a fairly new phenomenon. It hasn't been around for many years. Indeed, I've been working at MEED for nearly 20 years, and it was only really 3 years ago that we started to have conversations around hydrogen. And indeed, you can see that illustrated here quite nicely. So MEED.com produces thousands of articles, news, features, analysis every year. And until 2020, there were very few mentions of the word hydrogen. In fact, the first mention of the phrase green hydrogen didn't appear in MEED.com, and MEED.com has been running since 1957, by the way. First, the phrase green hydrogen was written in MEED was in October 2019, for example. And from that point, suddenly it was mentioned a lot more. And you can see here that from 57 mentions of the word hydrogen in 2020, we jumped to 285 usages of the word in 2021 and 286 so far this year, with another month to go. So we've really seen, if this illustrates the level of interest or level of activity in hydrogen, then this really illustrates that. And then again in mid 2020, NEOM announced the Helios project with Air Products and Aquapower. And this is the region's first world-scale hydrogen project announcement. And in the end of 2020, we also heard the mention, or the first time, the use of the word blue hydrogen in MEED. So it is something that has very much come out into the market very recently. It is something now everyone is talking about. We had more than 2,000 people register for this webinar, which again just illustrates the levels of interest in this project. So let's go on to the next slide. So why is that? Why is it that suddenly everyone is talking about hydrogen as opposed to 3, 4, 5 years ago when it was very rarely mentioned? Well, there's a combination of factors, and I've touched upon quite a few of them already in this presentation. But we can see here that one of the key drivers for the development of hydrogen production projects and green hydrogen in particular in the Middle East and Africa is the falling costs of producing renewable energy, particularly solar power. You can see here over time that there's been a dramatic fall in the cost per kilowatt hour of producing electricity from different renewable energy sources. For example, solar power PV can now power from solar PV onshore can now produce electricity at approximately $0.045 a kilowatt hour. That's dramatically down on the 2010 number, mainly due to better technologies, but also cheaper production costs of solar panels. And this is reflected here on the right-hand side by falling tariffs for IPPs. You can see here that the levelized cost of electricity for various projects, utility scale projects, has fallen over time, reaching a world record of 1.35 cents a kilowatt hour on the 2 gigawatt Al Dhafra solar PV in Abu Dhabi, which is one of the world's largest single site solar projects. So you can see over time, the cost has reduced, which makes the overall cost of electricity generation and hydrogen processing and the electrolysis process much more competitive compared with other fuel sources. So that's a very substantial reason why we've seen much more interest in hydrogen recently. A second reason is that it's clear that demand for hydrogen is going to grow. The IEA estimates that in 2020, there was a global demand of about 90 million tons a year of hydrogen, and expects this to jump to 200 million tons a year by 2030, and then 500 million tons a year by 2050. So that's a very sharp increase as the world moves to net zero, tries to decarbonize, move away from oil and gas, and therefore with soaring demand or soaring potential demand, it's no wonder that people are looking to invest in the market. So we're going to, with this same increase in supply, we will move from about $5 a kilo for on average for hydrogen production today to about 2 kilos on average in 2030, and probably even cheaper in the Middle East, given the higher solar radiation levels and cheaper renewable energy production cost. On the right-hand side, you can see some data explaining the current range of hydrogen prices and what it's forecast to become from various different sources by 2030 and then by 2050. And as you can see, it becomes more and more economic to produce green hydrogen over time, and will eventually also become cheaper than blue-gray hydrogen as well. So a very substantial surge in demand, and the IEA estimates that by 2050, the value of hydrogen as a fuel be worth some $10 trillion. And of course, it's coming from a very low base today, but it's clear that there is a huge potential for the market. So those two reasons, along with a number of other drivers, are really what's accelerating this sudden surge in investment in hydrogen projects, particularly green hydrogen in the Middle East and Africa. So just to sum up, clearly the region suffers or benefits from a number of significant advantages. It lies in a desert zone. For a lot of the countries in Southern Africa and in the Middle East, of course, which provides very high solar irradiation levels. There's also a lot of space to build large-scale PV projects and complexes. And because the Middle East sits in the middle of the main Asia to Europe trade routes and shipping routes, it's also in a fantastic location to export hydrogen or ammonia to other parts of the world. Likewise, from a government perspective, political and economic perspective, hydrogen offers one of the best solutions to substitute or replace oil and gas production. Over the next 2 decades or so, it's inevitable that demand for hydrocarbons will slow, as these are the main revenue generators for the countries of the region. Hydrogen offers them an opportunity to replace hydrocarbons as their main export, and so it makes plenty of economic and political sense to focus on hydrogen as well. As we mentioned, demand is growing for hydrogen in the long run, and costs or supply are dropping. So the economics for hydrogen projects are also increasingly beneficial. We've seen also, again, politically, that the Russia-Ukraine crisis has seen a large surge in gas and oil prices. And in Europe in particular, it's clear that there has to be a diversification of sources for fuel and less dependence on one particular market. Hydrogen offers that is a relatively new and different solution for fuel imports. So again, there's political impetus for the development of hydrogen as a result. And of course, hydrogen fits very well with the net zero ambitions and the decarbonization targets set by many countries. And also the region can benefit from a first mover advantage by developing a huge amount of capacity today rather than later. And then from a blue hydrogen perspective, well, of course, the region has some of the world's biggest investments downstream, some of the world's biggest production centers, and there's also plenty of blue hydrogen potential as well once carbon capture and storage can be implemented. So let's just take a look at a more granular detail at the hydrogen market itself from a project's perspective. Now, one of the key decisions that needs to be made, or technical decisions that need to be made on each project, is the type of electrolysis technology to be used on projects. Now, of the 1,400 or so global known hydrogen projects, the majority use proton exchange membranes or electrolysis technology, PEM or PEM. The second most common type of electrolysis technology applied is alkaline electrolysis technology. And then in terms of blue hydrogen, then we also have natural gas with carbon capture and storage, normally underground. And then solid oxide and biomass technologies can also be applied to electrolysis. However, given that the vast majority of hydrogen projects are still at the concept or announcement stage, decisions on their electrolysis technology have either not yet been taken or not yet disclosed. So we expect the same general trend to be followed in terms of the technologies currently applied, but this illustrates the different technologies that can be used. And there may well be some emerging ones that are applied in greater number going forward. Now, in terms of the output for the hydrogen projects in the pipeline in the Middle East and Africa, the vast majority are going to be in the form of hydrogen, either directly exported from the project or utilized in local networks. The second most common output is going to be in terms of ammonia, green ammonia. That is, the hydrogen is converted into and combined with nitrogen from an air separation unit and exported as ammonia. Ammonia is much denser and is easier to transport long distance than hydrogen is. So it would be liquefied, put onto specially designed ships, sent to an export market, and then either reconverted back to hydrogen or left as methanol, as ammonia, sorry. But there are other outputs: methanol, synfuels, methane, and various other products that can also be derived from hydrogen production. So you can see there's some 1,400 projects. The vast majority, more than 1,100, are in hydrogen. In the Middle East, you can see that of the known projects, just under 50% are in the form of hydrogen. The vast majority of the rest of the remaining known 30 projects are in ammonia, and then we have 6 other projects using a different output. So very much an ammonia and hydrogen game when it comes to hydrogen projects. Now, in terms of the distribution geographically of known projects, known hydrogen projects in the Middle East and Africa, it's dominated by just a handful of countries. Egypt is the market leader. Indeed, just this week, there were 2 further hydrogen projects announced, including one this morning, and it's growing all the time. So Egypt's 29 known hydrogen projects at the moment, with just one having been completed. That's the Ain Sokna 20,000 ton a year green hydrogen pilot project. Then we have the UAE, which has 18 planned projects, which we'll have a look at in a bit. Oman has 14 across in Duqm, Salalah, and Sohar, all destined for export. And some of the biggest projects in the world are in Oman. Morocco has 8 projects. Again, it's benefiting from its geographic location close to Europe. South Africa has 8 projects, Saudi Arabia 7, and Namibia 5. Then Qatar 3, Kenya 2, Mauritania 2, and then other countries have a total of 15. So it's very much focused on a handful of countries, all of which have a lot of space, all of which have excellent solar irradiation and wind levels for renewable energy, and all of them well located for export projects. So this is really where the market is focused at the moment, but over time we expect that to become more geographically diversified. Now, from a global perspective, the Middle East and Africa, when we total up all the projects, equates to about 8% of known hydrogen projects globally, or this number is changing fast. So while they represent about 8% of all projects, it's also worth noting that they do tend to be on average much larger than hydrogen projects elsewhere. So in terms of number of projects, about 8%, but in terms of total output per total production capacity, that number will be far higher. And again, looking at the Middle East and Africa projects by type, we have 98 green hydrogen projects planned, which will be using renewable energies, as we saw, mainly solar and wind, some hydropower in Central Africa, but mainly solar and wind to power the electrolysis of hydrogen from seawater. And then at the moment, just 14 blue hydrogen projects using existing industrial processes to capture the CO2 and to produce hydrogen that way. Again, that is likely to change, but at the moment the focus is very much on green hydrogen in terms of known projects. And again, in terms of the breakdown of projects, hydrogen projects in Middle East Africa by electricity source, as I mentioned, solar and wind projects combined, or just solar projects, are the vast majority of fuel sources for green hydrogen. We have gas, natural gas used primarily in industrial processes, downstream oil and gas facilities, being the source of 13 projects for electrolysis. Hydro energy, just 2, biomass, 3 projects. And as you can see, it's really all about using clean renewable energy in the Middle East and Africa for hydrogen production. So just a couple of reminders, all this data, along with a lot more, a detailed breakdown and summary and profile of every single project, known hydrogen project, blue and green in the Middle East and Africa, and a lot more data, summary and analysis will be in our forthcoming Middle East and Africa Hydrogen Projects report, which is released at the end of this month. If you want to know more or wish to purchase and benefit from an early bird discount, and then please enter this code. You can see here, scan this QR code to take you to the website. As you can see, there's a $500 discount, and if you use the code, there's an extra $100 on top of that. And again, just a reminder as well that I will be taking questions, the QA at the end of this presentation. So if you do have any questions, please put them into the chat box, Q&A box, and I will try to answer them at the end of this session. And again, just to remind everyone that you should be receiving this presentation in your inbox as we speak. And also it is being recorded, so you will be able to look at it in your own time in a couple of days once it's been edited. Okay, let's take a look in more detail at some of the individual hydrogen projects coming up. So as I mentioned, you can see there's more than 100 green and blue hydrogen projects coming up in the Middle East and Africa. And you can see a selection of some of the largest ones here. You can see that they're focused, as I mentioned earlier, in a specific number of countries, particularly Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Oman, UAE, Namibia, and South Africa. And you'll also see here that with one or two exceptions, almost all of the projects have only been announced in the last 24 months or so, and are therefore either at the concept stage still or have entered feasibility without final investment decision yet being made. In many cases as well, the precise output, renewable energy requirements, electrolyzer capacity has not been revealed or has not been determined, but it's also very clear that there is well over $100 billion of pipeline for hydrogen projects in Africa and Middle East, and will provide lots of opportunities for contractors, consultants, and suppliers for many years to come. You can see here some of the projects as well as the stakeholders. Generally speaking, there's a lot of private sector participation in these projects, sometimes in coordination with national oil companies or government entities, which will give the necessary backing and support for projects. A lot of the time, the challenge is around finding long-term offtake agreements in order to secure financing for the projects. Nonetheless, even if only 50% of these projects actually materialize, there's still a huge market potential. And from about 2024, 2025 onwards, we will start to see a lot of work on the ground if all comes to plan. So taking a look in a little bit more detail about some of the individual projects, I'll just go through half a dozen or so, as we haven't got time to obviously go through all 100 of them, or 100 plus of them. But you can see here, this is one of the largest projects. This one is in Namibia. Namibia is touted as having one of the best hydrogen production potential in the world, thanks to its huge amount of space and very, very high solar irradiation levels. This is one of the first projects. It's the Hyphen Hydrogen Energy Project on the coast in the South Kahib National Park. It's a private sector development with a project company called Hyphen Hydrogen Energy, which is a JV between two private sector entities. It's worth just under $10 billion and will produce about 350,000 tons a year all told once it's fully up and running, and about 1.7 million tons a year of ammonia. This should, in its first phase, be completed by 2026 and its final phase around 2030. It will require between 5 and 6 gigawatts of solar and wind renewable energy. You can see here some of the key details. In terms of the resources, it's going to benefit from about 10 meters a second on average wind speed and 2,600 to 2,800 full load hours a year of solar of sunshine. As you can see here, already quite a number of players are on board in terms of doing the strategic and financial advisory. Boston Consulting Group and Lazard and Slaughter and May and ENS are helping on the legal advisory side. This is the location of the project and just an overview of some of the different elements of it. It's covering an area of around 4,000 kilometers squared of area. You can see it's comprised of quite a considerable number of wind farms and solar PV complexes, which will be surrounding an electrolysis site. And the central basic research done on hydrogen projects in Namibia estimates that green hydrogen in Namibia be some of the most cost competitive in the world at just €1.50 to €2 a kilo, which is amongst the cheapest anywhere right now in the world. From the electrolysis site, the electricity will be transmitted via overhead line to the hydrogen hub, where it can be converted into ammonia and exported from a custom-built export terminal. Any excess electricity can be transmitted back into the Namibian national grid, and of course, hydrogen, the energy from the renewable energy, will also be used to process and treat the seawater into desalinated seawater, which is necessary for electrolysis. Electrolysis generally requiring water to be treated before electrolysis can happen, although new technologies are emerging that can potentially remove the need for desalination, which itself is a costly element of the capex. So that's one exciting project which we expect to go to market once a final investment decision is made over the next 18 months or so, and is therefore going to represent a multi-billion-dollar opportunity there. Now, closer to the Middle East, this is one of the world's largest green hydrogen projects, worth close to $30 billion, and that's the GEO, or Green Energy Oman project in Duqm in south central Oman. It's going to have a total solar and wind production capacity of a staggering 25 gigawatts, of which 14 gigawatts will be in the terms of the electrolyzing capacity. In turn, this will be able to produce about 1.8 million tons of green hydrogen, equivalent to about 10 million tons annually of ammonia. So certainly one of the world's largest green hydrogen projects. The client on this is a combination of OQ, the Omani National Energy Company, Hong Kong-based Intercontinental Energy, and Enertech, which is a government-supported holding company from Kuwait. So very major stakeholders in the project. The land area, as you can see, is vast, but is in the desert, and is certainly Oman has the space and the location to be really benefit from large-scale hydrogen production. So a very significant project. Feasibility is already ongoing by Worley, and there's also the impact and ESIA being done, environmental social impact assessment being done by HMR. And already in terms of the demand and offtake, Korean Gas Technology Corporation has already signed an MOU to explore potential opportunities. So we expect pre-qualification for the different EPC packages on this to potentially start in 2024, 2025, with a view for first energy output from 2028, according to the client, and then ramped up in phases to full capacity by 2038. So very exciting project there. Another really interesting project is a new green ammonia project in Kizad, the Khalifa Industrial Zone in Abu Dhabi. This one is by Helios Industry, not to be confused with the Helios project in Neom. But this is approximately $1 billion green ammonia project, producing about 200,000 tons a year of ammonia from approximately 800 megawatts of solar PV capacity. So Deloitte has already signed up to advise on the transaction element of it. ThyssenKrupp of Germany is doing the technical study, and the Key players or stakeholders in this are some very major engineering and power companies and power developers: KEPCO, Samsung C&T, Chemitech, Petrolin, and Coepo. So very substantial stakeholders behind it, very large stakeholders, which again gives good optimism that the project will be able to proceed. So we are expecting potentially construction to start around 2024 with the aim of completion around 2026, 2027. So very exciting, again, very exciting project, Abu Dhabi being one of the world's cheapest places to produce solar energy, as we saw earlier in terms of tariffs. Now, a very different type of project, one of the most innovative in the Middle East and Africa, is this fairly new project in Egypt, which is basically not using renewable energy, but using waste to generate power for a hydrogen plant. So this $3 billion project is called the H2 Waste Hydrogen Facility. Its client is H2 Industries, a German company, which is also going to be doing the EPC element, and it has signed up or had a permit for land at the Suez Canal Zone and the Suez Economic Zone Authority to develop this particular project. It's going to have a hydrogen capacity of about 300,000 tons a year, which will be derived from approximately 4 million tons a year of organic waste and non-recyclable plastic. So rather than using renewable energy, it's actually going to use waste. And of course, the carbon from that waste will be treated, captured, and stored. Now, unlike some of the other projects, or most of the projects we see in the Middle East and Africa, this is not going to be an export-orientated project. This is instead the output, hydrogen output, is going to be liquefied and distributed locally in trucks. So that is, again, another reason why it's quite different. We should start to see construction packages for this to emerge around 2024, and potentially with the project being completed by 2026, 2027. So a very different type of hydrogen project there. And then one more project to just illustrate today. This is also in KEZAD in Abu Dhabi. This is the Bruges Energy Hydrogen Project. This is 300,000 tons a year of green ammonia in the first phase at a cost of about $1.5 billion, with the option or potential to upgrade further to 600,000 tons a year. It has already E&Y on board for consultancy services, and ThyssenKrupp Uhde is doing the technical study for the project. The land lease agreement, preliminary land lease agreement, has already been agreed on with KEZAD, and we expect, as I said, tenders for the EPC elements to come out over the next 18 months or so. So there are more than 100 green hydrogen, blue hydrogen projects in the pipeline in the Middle East and Africa. Not all of them will happen, of course, but even if only half of them happen, there is still going to be easily more than $100 billion of contracts needed, or capex needed, to develop these projects, either in the form of renewable energy facilities, air separation units, electrolysis plants, hydrogen and ammonia production plants, and export facilities. So very exciting opportunity, which we're only just at the beginning of. So we've talked a lot about the potential. There are still, however, a number of challenges that need to be dealt with and overcome for the market to really grow. The first one is that we're still at a very early stage, and the market really has still yet to really prove itself. There are only 2 projects under construction and 1 completed, and still very much the rest are still at the economic viability and feasibility stage, without final investment decisions yet being taken. But as I said, with so many projects announced and so many new ones coming to market all the time, then we are really excited and expect that even if only half come, there'll still be a significant opportunity. Key issues is the lack of offtake agreements and demand in general. Obviously, projects can't be financed, fully financed until there is demand secured and offtake agreements signed. And as yet, due to the higher cost of hydrogen and the sort of hesitancy around the investment costs required for infrastructure, receiving infrastructure, de-liquefying the ammonia or hydrogen, there is still a lot of costs associated with that, and as it's still more expensive than gas-fired production, then there's still some hesitancy around demand. But this will change, as for reasons we've outlined earlier, and we fully expect that over the next few months and years we will see the signing of several long-term offtake agreements, which will ensure that these projects go ahead. Another stumbling block is that in the Middle East and Africa, with some exceptions, almost all of the planned hydrogen output and ammonia output is for export to other countries by ship mainly. There's still not much talk of a domestic demand for hydrogen. This will come over time using existing infrastructure, but when you look at where some of the hydrogen projects are located, a lot of them are far from the centers of domestic demand. And of course, with oil and gas so plentiful and so cheaply produced in the region, it's going to be a bit of a struggle to adopt hydrogen locally. But this is going to change with the adoption of net zero targets in the region and the incentives and targets for net zero. Another key stumbling block is electrolyzer capacity. There is only currently about 8 gigawatts globally of electrolyzer manufacturing capacity. And just looking at the Middle East and Africa alone, looking at the projects, there needs to be some 75 gigawatts of electrolyzer manufacturing capacity to meet all the demand that these projects will require. So there's clearly going to be massive investment globally in the production of electrolyzers. This is happening very rapidly, but still, this could have an impact on electrolyzer costs, which are a significant element of the overall capex on projects. And we'll have to see how that goes. And then finally, there is also some debate at a political level or policy level around whether hydrogen should be the core component going forward as a fuel source for many countries. Just to illustrate and give a case in point, in the UK, while there is quite a lot of lobbying going on for hydrogen as a fuel source, it has been pointed out from an economic perspective that air source heat pump technology, for example, is a much more cost-effective and efficient means of powering boilers for home heating. And it won't be for several years, nearly 2 decades, until hydrogen energy is cheap enough and efficient enough to actually be cheaper than to provide fewer emissions than air source heat pump technology. And of course, there are various alternatives. There's simply generating renewable energy directly. In many countries, there is also nuclear power, for example, waste to energy, biomass, and other technologies which are being explored, wave technology, and so on. And so it remains to be seen just how widely adopted hydrogen is going to be globally. And nonetheless, as I've stressed several times, hydrogen project activity is going to jump in the region. There's going to be easily more than $100 billion worth of project opportunities if you're a consultant, an EPC contractor, civils contractor, or just a supplier across that value chain, whether it's in renewable energy, electrolysis, marine export facilities, or general infrastructure. There is a magnificent and substantial opportunity in this new emerging sector coming up across different countries of the 2 regions. So should be a lot of optimism for the market ahead. So again, just to remind you, all this that I've gone through today and a lot more, several hundred slides worth of data on each individual project, a lot more granular analysis around the economics of hydrogen production, a lot of content analysis on blue hydrogen production, demand, supply, all these other elements are in our Middle East and Africa Hydrogen Projects report. If you want to know more, please visit buy.meed.com. There's a discount at the moment for everyone attending today and who purchased before 25th of November. Please contact us or visit our website to find out more. You'll be getting a copy of this presentation in your inbox, hopefully during the course of this webinar. And it's also being recorded, so you'll be able to review it in your own time or share the presentation with others or share the video as well. Okay, so as I promised, we'll now take some questions. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box and I will attempt to answer them. So we've got already 31 questions, so I will attempt to answer them. So first question, are there any hydrogen projects planned in Jordan? I don't believe I've seen yet any hydrogen projects in Jordan. However, Jordan is a major player in wind and solar energy, particularly wind energy. It's got a great wind profile on the Red Sea coast and Gulf of Aqaba. So I wouldn't be surprised if we do start to see some hydrogen projects being announced there, especially given that Jordan is a net energy importer, doesn't have a lot of gas resources of its own, and therefore it makes perfect sense to look at alternative fuel sources. So it's actually surprising that there hasn't been much hydrogen activity yet in the Kingdom of Jordan, but I expect that we'll see some announcements over time. Okay, interesting question here, which I haven't yet discussed, which is about storage capacity of electricity produced from renewable energy in the form of battery energy storage systems, BESS, and how they compare with other energy sources, such as gas-fired energy production. So generally speaking, certainly in the Middle East and in some parts of Africa, there hasn't been a lot of investment in battery energy storage, simply because the dynamics of the electricity industry are slightly different. Demand tends to be during the day. High demand peak periods tend to be in the day and much lower at night, when obviously you can't generate solar power. And therefore, the need for storing electricity is much lower. Likewise, the utilities are highly centralized in the Middle East and therefore are able to deal or process highs and lows in demand and peak demand quite efficiently without resorting to storage capacity. However, when you're looking at projects in more remote areas, such as the tourism development projects at NEOM or Red Sea, the Red Sea Global Project, Amala, and so on, then there is likely to be battery energy storage because these projects are not so easily connected to the national grid. So the projects, the renewable energy projects there are probably going to take advantage of and will require investment in battery energy storage systems. Thank you for the webinar. May I ask why there is a lot more investment in the Middle East while carbon emissions are higher in total in places like China, USA, and South Korea, which is a very good question. The Middle East in particular has some of the world's highest per capita emissions in total, very high per capita emissions, certainly higher than the per capita emission in China or USA. But the population overall is much lower, and therefore the total carbon emissions from the Middle East is much lower than higher population centers elsewhere. So why, therefore, there is so much interest in investment in green energy, green hydrogen in the Middle East and not in those locations? Well, first of all, there is a lot of investment going to happen in hydrogen in places like China and USA and Japan and so forth, and South Korea and Europe. But simply put, the Middle East has much lower cost renewable energy production costs. It also benefits from a huge amount of space, which allows for the construction of very vast solar PV fields, and likewise is geographically and is able to export elsewhere. So when you're looking at, say, China or South Korea, they don't have those same levels of cheap renewable energy potential. And while they do have the market for hydrogen, they're not necessarily able to produce it in a cost competitive manner. And this is really why the Middle East is going at it so fast, is that because they feel, just as they can with their oil and gas, they can produce hydrogen at a much lower cost than elsewhere. So I hope that answers your question. Right, so about water availability for the hydrogen production process and the cost of water treatment for electrolysis. It's another very good question. So as you may have gathered from the presentation today, looking at the projects, all, if not, well, I think, yes, all known hydrogen projects, blue or green, in the Middle East and Africa are on the coast. And one of the reasons they're on the coast is the easy access to water in the form of seawater, obviously, but also easier for the export of hydrogen or ammonia overseas. So in terms of the water availability, it's all going to be desalinated in the most part. And this, of course, adds extra capex. Currently, most seawater water has to be desalinated and treated before it can be used in the electrolysis process. Otherwise, it will damage the electrodes, electrolyzers. And this obviously adds cost, but it also requires energy. But by integrating a desalination plant into the overall project, and using the waste heat or the electricity generated as directly through the renewable energy components, you can use that energy to desalinate the water. So when we're looking at all these projects, there are four main cost centers. There's the solar and wind renewable element. There is the electrolysis process. There's the hydrogen and ammonia production plant costs. There's the air separation unit costs where required, and then there's the desalination cost as well. Now, we're using reverse osmosis, membrane technology. The amount of energy required in desalination can be reduced as well, so free up as much energy as possible for electrolysis. But of course, desalination is going to add a bit of capex to that. And the final cost element is the overhead transmission lines or the water pipelines and the export facilities for the hydrogen. So a comment really here, and I think I've basically agreed or shared this comment myself during the presentation, is that most of the projects currently in the Middle East and Africa are still at the concept stage or feasibility stage. That is quite right. The region is still, most of the projects don't have an offtake agreement, and until they do, it's difficult for them to proceed because they won't be able to get the financing. And the main reason for that is that hydrogen production is still more expensive than other fuel sources. And until it comes down or countries realize that they will have to pay more for clean fuels, then it's still going to be difficult for demand to pick up. Nonetheless, we saw that demand is expected to increase rapidly over the next 30 years. We do expect technologies to improve and become more efficient, which will bring down hydrogen production costs to lower than the gas-fired energy costs today. So the expectation is that with these decreasing costs and increasing demand, there will be space and a commercial viability for hydrogen projects. Okay, I have had quite a few technical questions, which I'm afraid are, not being an engineer or hydrogen technical specialist, I'm not necessarily able to answer. However, we will make a note of them and come back to you hopefully with the response. So apologies if you have a technical question. I'm not able to necessarily answer them. Okay, so a question here about the role wind energy can play in hydrogen production. So the GCC as a whole is dominated by solar PV energy in particular. If you look at some of the utility connected solar power plants, some of which are the biggest in the world in the GCC, they are mainly solar PV. And that is because the solar radiation levels, as you would expect in the desert, are extremely high. The wind profile along the Gulf Coast isn't suitable for large-scale wind generation. On the other hand, on the Red Sea, you do see much better wind profiling, and therefore you do have a large number of wind farm projects along the Red Sea coast, as well as in Morocco and some other areas. But so therefore, solar tends to be the main source of hydrogen production, particularly in the GCC. But wind is still certainly going to play a role, and indeed, a fairly large chunk of the projects will be a combination of wind and solar energy. So there's still going to be scope for wind, but it's definitely leaning towards more solar electricity production from solar projects than it is from wind. What is the Middle East and Africa market for green hydrogen uses in industrial sectors like cement, steel, petrochemical, and heavy transport? Well, the potential for green hydrogen in these sectors is enormous. Clearly, some of the world's largest cement, steel, petrochemical facilities, iron complexes are in the Middle East. And of course, they can all use hydrogen in their captive power plants, their turbines to produce electricity, and also just for industrial electrification purposes in general. So it's massive potential. However, the economics at the moment don't really stand up, and unless there is some regulatory push to make these industries use cleaner fuels, then it's very difficult to see this happening in the short term. As I said, almost all the green hydrogen projects currently are destined for export. We have seen on the blue hydrogen side some experiments for carbon capture and storage, for example, in the Emirates Steel Al Rayada project, which treats or captures the carbon dioxide in the steelmaking process and then pipes it and buries it or uses it for gas reinjection purposes in some oil and gas fields. However, these are few and far between. It's still quite an expensive process. And until, as I said, there's some regulatory push or the infrastructure is in place, or that the cost of using hydrogen, producing hydrogen decreases, then it's still some way away from using it in industry in the Middle East and Africa. And indeed, this has been proven by the fact that none of these projects really are focused on this market, and as I said, are mainly for export. What is the most economic way for the production and transport of hydrogen? Well, the most economic way, generally speaking, is to produce from the hydrogen green ammonia, because hydrogen is quite a light gas and also has a lower melting point than ammonia. Is much easier and cost effective to convert to ammonia or other gases like methanol or methane, and then liquefy the ammonia, which is much denser, and transport it by ship. And indeed, if we look at most of the projects, that tends to be the way forward for that. Hydrogen in a shorter distance can be piped or even liquefied by truck, as we saw. But generally speaking, the most economic way is to convert it to ammonia and liquefy and then export. What's the difference between green and blue hydrogen? So blue hydrogen is coming from primarily existing industrial resources using gas as the feedstock, but capturing the CO2 and other harmful emissions or substances generally in the pre-power generation process, and then storing that carbon underground. So you might pipe it to an oil field, for example, and you inject it into the surface and store it there, or even use it to replace gas as a reinjection to reinject into oil and gas fields to maintain output and reservoir pressure. So there's a number of things you can do with blue hydrogen projects. However, again, it's costly, and it does affect the fundamental economics of projects. So this is one of the drawbacks, economic drawbacks, which has really hindered the development of blue hydrogen in the region. Green hydrogen, on the other hand, is totally net carbon neutral or net zero, because it produces the electricity for electrolysis from renewable sources, mainly solar and wind. When can we start to see regional power generation projects using hydrogen as a fuel, or even fuel blending with natural gas, and actually seeing it happen rather than just being conceptualized or proposed? Again, I think we're still quite far away from that happening whole scale in the region. At the end of the day, gas is plentiful, it's cheap, and it's going to be difficult to replace that with a much more expensive fuel. Most turbines nowadays can run on a blend of natural gas and hydrogen, or even use just hydrogen, and the pipeline networks can also be adapted to use hydrogen. But when we look at some of these hydrogen projects, they're not really near centers of demand. For example, the hydrogen projects in Oman are in Duqm, for example, Salalah, a long way away from where the power plants or the demand for electricity is. So I haven't really seen any firm proposals yet for using hydrogen as a local power generation source. At the end of the day, many countries can simply just generate electricity using solar energy projects directly. And indeed, that's really the path that, if you look at, say, Saudi Arabia, Oman and UAE are doing for their electricity requirements. That's really what they're doing now, especially as the cost of solar production is reducing quite considerably. What is the water requirement to produce 1 kilogram of hydrogen? I'm afraid I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head. I hopefully will come back to you and answer that following this presentation. Are blue or green projects more likely to close financial close or reach offtake agreement? It's a good question. Currently, my expectation is that we're more likely to see green hydrogen projects go ahead than blue hydrogen projects. Carbon capture and storage technology has been around for a while and not really adopted in the region, whereas green hydrogen project is much newer as a sector coming up. And when we look at the dynamics, I believe it makes more sense commercially for green hydrogen projects to go ahead currently. Certainly that pipeline suggests that, because there are far more green hydrogen projects than there are blue ones currently. Just going through your questions now. Thank you for all of them all. There's 87 questions, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to answer all of them, but we'll give it a go in the minutes that are remaining for us. So a question here: we're consuming electricity to produce hydrogen. So how can it be beneficial? Well, it's beneficial because you can use renewable energy to electrolyze the seawater to produce hydrogen, and therefore produce electricity with no emissions. And you can then use that hydrogen more flexibly, whether it's in, for example, transport as a fuel for cars, whether it's directly to heat homes, and to replace gas in general, which electricity in itself cannot really substitute. So this is one of the main reasons really why we're looking at hydrogen as a resource. So question here again about desalination. Where's the water coming from for these hydrogen projects? Yes, it's all coming from desalination. Clearly there are, in the desert areas, there was no water resources to use, so they will all be, water will have to be desalinated, and every project incorporates a desalination plant, and that is, generally speaking, incorporated into the capex figures that we've mentioned today. In Central Africa, there is talk about using hydropower and instead of renewable energy or solar wind energy, still renewable, as a means of producing green hydrogen, but that's still very much in the early conversation stages. Okay, let's keep moving. The question here about storage of hydrogen. Yeah, so storage would generally be when hydrogen is being produced, it's likely to be stored either in liquefied in ammonia, as ammonia or liquefied hydrogen stored, in order for it to then be loaded onto ships when required for export. I believe ammonia is slightly less flammable than hydrogen as well, so there's some benefits there. Alternatively, some of the hydrogen in some cases will be exported directly via pipeline to end users. So a lot of these projects will incorporate storage hubs as well. Okay, so another question about Hydrom in Oman. So Hydrom is a new entity set up by the government in Oman recently, which also launched 2 bidding rounds recently for land acquisition for hydrogen projects. And given that there's this now public auction process for hydrogen projects, will it affect the planned or already announced hydrogen projects in Oman? It's a very good question. I don't believe it will, simply because the government is in many cases stakeholders in these already announced hydrogen projects, and I believe it will be those will be complementary to any hydrogen projects won in the Hydrom auction. So it might have some impact, but as it stands, the other projects in Oman are still live, although that might change. Are there any possibilities that there'll be a hydrogen project in Qatar in the near future? So the hydrogen projects in Qatar are mainly blue hydrogen projects based on their own existing industrial facilities. I'm not aware yet of a green hydrogen project coming up. Obviously less space in Qatar for green hydrogen. It also doesn't have the sort of kind of pressing need to diversify the economy as other countries, having some of the world's largest gas resources. And that will probably change. I'm sure over the next 18 months or so, other countries in the GCC that haven't got green hydrogen projects to date will indeed launch their own ones. So I imagine that will change. A question here about nickel alloys for hydrogen projects. Again, fairly technical question, I'm afraid I can't answer. But again, it's something we can look at and come back to you. Subsidies for hydrogen. It's a very good question. Are there any subsidies for hydrogen production? As far as I know, no, there isn't. And I think that we're some way away from that happening, simply because there are, in many cases, already subsidies for gas-fired production, and it would be even more expensive to subsidize hydrogen production. Where governments are assisting is in providing the land and any associated infrastructure, and supporting the projects potentially with stakeholders. But I'm not aware yet of any subsidies being offered directly for the production of hydrogen. Do you think that COP27 will lead to a domestic political push for African countries to invest in hydrogen and ammonia projects? So Africa is a very interesting case because, of course, Africa suffers from what we call the energy trilemma, which is that there is scarcity of supply of electricity. It's not very centralized, and it's expensive, more expensive. It's too expensive for a lot of the population to utilize, even if they were connected. So this is why renewables, off-grid renewable captive electricity generation is seen as a way forward for many countries in Africa to start increasing their electricity output and connecting their populations. And how hydrogen and ammonia fits into that is a very interesting topic. So if you are developing renewable energy resources and you've got good renewable energy potential, then you also have the potential for hydrogen production. But if the priority is to extend electricity provision rather than to produce clean fuels, then the focus is likely to be on the off-grid construction of renewable energy projects rather than hydrogen. But again, this has changed. Let's see, Namibia is a leader, South Africa is a leader in green hydrogen production in the African continent. And again, a lot of these projects are for export, but also they're going to complement the fuel mix for power generation as well. What is the next milestone for the NEOM project? Well, the NEOM project is under construction. The EPC contracts mostly have been awarded under Air Products. I believe ThyssenKrupp is doing the hydrogen ammonia plant. There are some other companies like CCC working on the electrolysis and hydrogen processes, civil elements as well. Larsen Toubro is the contractor on the initial solar and wind farm phases as well. So it's under construction and is likely to be completed over the next 2 to 3 years or so. And this will be the first world-scale hydrogen production in the region. There is one other project which is completed, and it was completed during the COP27 event, and that's in Egypt, in Sokhna. That's a 20,000 ton a year hydrogen project sponsored by Orascom Industry, and that is actually the first major hydrogen project in the region, but is not at the same scale as the projects that we've been talking about today. Nonetheless, it's a really great step forward, and it shows that it can be done. Okay, so we're running out of time, so I'm going to just take a couple more questions. I'm sorry if I haven't got around to answering them all. I can see there's now over 100 questions. So obviously I won't be able to ask them, but we are making a note of them, and we will try and come back to you with the answer for them if I haven't been able to answer them today. Okay, you mentioned only the proton and alkaline membranes today in the webinar. You haven't mentioned the solid oxide membranes. Well, I think early on in the presentation, I did illustrate that globally, PEM and AKE electrolysis technologies are going to be the main ones employed and form the vast majority. But there is a handful of several dozen projects using solid oxide membrane electrolysis process. And it's inevitable that over time, newer technologies are going to come into the electrolysis process. And if they are more efficient and potentially cheaper, could well be used. And so the trends could well develop and change over time, and especially given the crunch on electrolyzer manufacturing capacity, which I mentioned earlier. Is there any hydrogen project in Kuwait? Not that I know of, no. I mean, Kuwait has been a bit of a laggard in developing renewable energy generally, and there's certainly scope for blue hydrogen projects, but not to date. I haven't seen any green hydrogen element there, and we'll wait and see. This may well change over the next few months and years. Question here from an energy firm. Are you aware of the ownership profile of the projects in the MENA region? Are they more publicly owned or state, or have they more state involvement? And this is a really interesting question. As we know, in the Middle East, oil and gas market or sector is dominated by national oil companies. With some exceptions, there's very little private sector participation in upstream or downstream oil and gas production and processing. However, when it comes to hydrogen, we can see that it is very decentralized, that the private sector is making the biggest movement or investment on these hydrogen projects. Now, some of them do have NOC involvement or government involvement, OQ, for example, in some projects in Oman, ADNOC and Masdar in some projects in Abu Dhabi, some government entities involved in some of the hydrogen projects in Egypt. But by and large, the projects and the investments themselves are being developed or pushed by the private sector. And this is a very interesting shift and contrasts sharply with the oil and gas sector generally in the region. So yes, the majority of projects, hydrogen projects in the region, are actually through green hydrogen, particularly are through private sector. No, blue hydrogen, given that most of the industrial assets are one way or the other owned by the government or their national oil company or government-related entities, and that's a slightly different issue. But that is the situation. Right, last question. Most of the majority of hydrogen is going to be exported as per the existing projects. It can be also transported by pipe. Yes. As I mentioned, almost all the hydrogen projects so far announced are for export, and certainly the green hydrogen ones. Hydrogen can be exported using existing pipeline infrastructure, but to date, there doesn't seem to be much focus on that, and it's still very much export orientated. That's something that will certainly have to be addressed in the long run, I believe, but mainly through policies by governments and so on. Okay, so I haven't got, unfortunately, there's so many questions, and there's obviously a huge amount of interest in the hydrogen market and hydrogen projects in the Middle East and Africa. I'm really sorry if I haven't got a chance to answer all your questions. You should all have the presentation in your inbox already, and you'll be able to look at the presentation again. I do apologize for any technical mishaps at the beginning when there was a misalignment between what I was saying and the slides you could view. Do apologize, but you do have the chance to look at the slides in full with the downloaded presentation in your email. And of course, I'm recording this as well, so you will be able to look at it. We'll send you the link for that as well. Just one final reminder, please, if you are interested more in the hydrocarbon projects market, we do have a report coming up, which is more of what you've seen in much more detail, much longer. This is 20 slides. We've got some 300, 400 slides of detailed project information, as well as economics around hydrogen technology aspects, supply and demand, and so on, and as well as a in-depth look at each of the individual projects themselves, the capacities, the clients, the values, outputs, timeframes, contract packages, and so on. So if you are interested to learn more, please go visit our site buy.meed.com or scan this QR code, and you will benefit from a nice discount if you purchase the report before 25th of November. You can even get a further discount by inputting the webinar 100 code. We've got my details here, my email address, my telephone number. If any of you wish to reach out to me, email me, WhatsApp me, please feel free to do so at any time. I hope you enjoyed this in this session. I hope you found it informative and valuable. And I look forward to seeing you again very soon on our next webinar next month. Thank you very much for your attention. Goodbye.